Today, we're cracking open a bit of a historical cold case. We're going to investigate two phrases that you might have heard thrown around a lot, binding and loosing. And we're going to ask a pretty radical question. What if the way we commonly understand them today is completely wrong? Let's peel back the layers and see what the evidence actually says.
Just think about that for a second. What if a phrase that people use all the time for, spiritual warfare and things like that, what if it actually started out as something much closer to a courtroom verdict? That's really the core question we're tackling. Has this modern idea completely overshadowed what was originally a powerful, real-world instruction?
So, let's treat this like a detective story. We're going to follow the clues hidden in language, in history, and even in grammar, to solve what I'm calling the case of the misunderstood command. Our mission here is to uncover what these words really meant to the people who heard them for the very first time.
All right, so every good investigation has to start by understanding the current story. Before we jump into the past, let's get a handle on the modern interpretation that we're putting under the microscope. What does binding and loosing mean to most people today?
Well, in a lot of modern circles, binding and loosing is basically seen as a primary tool for spiritual warfare. The idea is that you, as an individual, can personally bind some negative force to stop it, or you can loose something positive, like a blessing, into a situation. But here's the twist. Our research shows this is a pretty new idea. When you actually go back and look at the first century, the evidence for this kind of interpretation, it just isn't there.
Okay, now let's turn to our first piece of hard evidence. To really crack this case, we have to put ourselves into the world of the first century. We've got to understand the language that everyone back then would have instantly recognized, and that was the language of law and order.
You see, in first century Judea, the Hebrew terms asar and sharei weren't some kind of mystical incantation, not at all. They were technical rabbinic idioms. Think of it like legal jargon we use today, like when a lawyer says objection in a courtroom. Asar meant to bind, but in the sense of forbidding something, making it illegal. And sharei meant to loose, as in permitting something, making it lawful.
And this quote right here, it just nails the point home. This isn't some new fringe theory. It comes from a really foundational scholarly work by Strack and Billerbeck. For over 100 years, academics have known that these were legal terms. To bind was to forbid something by law. To loose was to permit it. This is our first major clue, and it's a big one.
And check this out. We have a real-world example that perfectly illustrates this. The historian Josephus, writing back then, describes a political takeover. He says the Pharisees got the power to loose those that were bound and to bind those that had been loosed. Now, he wasn't talking about demons. He was talking about their new authority to pardon prisoners and to make their own laws. This is straight-up historical proof that these terms were all about exercising real, legal, and political power.
So if binding and loosing is all about legal authority, then the next question is pretty obvious. Whose authority are we talking about? And this is where our investigation uncovers a truly revolutionary power shift. At that time, the ultimate legal authority rested with the Sanhedrin, which Jesus himself called the seat of Moses. You could basically think of them as the Supreme Court of their day. They held what's known as halakhic jurisdiction, which is a fancy way of saying they had the final word on interpreting the law and making rulings for everybody. They were the ones who decided what was forbidden and what was permitted.
And this is where things get truly radical. When Jesus gives his followers the keys of the kingdom and this authority to bind and loose, he's essentially staging a legal coup. He takes this centralized power that was held by the elite Sanhedrin and he hands it over to the ecclesia, which just means the local gathering, the community of his followers. All of a sudden, the power to make these massive legal and ethical decisions wasn't in the hands of a few elites in Jerusalem anymore. It belonged to everyday people, to the community itself.
Now, our next clue is a little more subtle, but it might be the most profound of all. It's actually hidden in the grammar of the original text, and it tells us not just what this authority is, but how it's actually supposed to work.
Okay, this clue is tucked away in the grammar of the original Greek text. Now, don't worry, we're not going to get too lost in the weeds here, but the specific verb tense that's used is absolutely fascinating. Instead of saying, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, it's phrased in a way that's more like, whatever you bind on earth will have already been bound in heaven. It's a small change, but it has massive implications. For any grammar nerds out there, it's called the periphrastic future perfect passive, but all you really need to know is what it does.
This specific verb tense, it changes everything. It completely flips the order of operations. You see, the community isn't just making up new rules on Earth and then asking heaven to approve them. No, it works the other way around. First, a reality is established by God's will up in heaven. Second, the community's job is to figure out, to discern what that reality is. And then finally, their declaration on Earth is just them confirming or ratifying what is already true. So their authority isn't in creating new laws, but in correctly identifying and applying the king's law.
Okay, so we've looked at the language, we've looked at the history, and we've even looked at the grammar. All the evidence is now on the table, so it's time to bring it all together and deliver the verdict of our investigation. So here's the bottom line. The evidence overwhelmingly shows that binding and loosing is a legislative and judicial authority. It's about a community discerning and then applying God's will. It's a corporate function. And here's what it is not. It's not a magic formula for individuals to do whatever they want. It's not about mystical exorcism. It is not a license to just invent arbitrary rules. And it is definitely not reserved for some special class of clergy. It belongs to the whole community acting together.
So after digging through all of this history, you might be asking yourself, okay, so what? Why does getting the original meaning of these ancient legal terms actually matter for us today?
Well, what does this all boil down to? When we put all the evidence together, the legal language, the transfer of power, the grammar, we get a brand new definition. Binding and loosing is the legislative and judicial authority of the local congregation to declare what is forbidden or permitted based on the prior established will of God. It's a huge shift from an individual mystical power to a weighty communal responsibility. And that brings us right to the final, and I think, provocative question. If binding and loosing isn't about an individual fighting their own spiritual battles, but it's about a community's shared judicial responsibility to live out God's will, well, what does that mean for how that community should function? How does that change our view on everything from ethics to accountability? That is a powerful idea to think about. Thanks for joining this explainer.